Early in the morning of May 10, 1940, a few men in the uniform of the Dutch military police walked onto the railway bridge at Gennep. They were marching a small group of German prisoners ahead of them. The Dutch guards let them pass because these were their own men. A few seconds later, those guards were dead and the bridge lay undamaged in German hands. The prisoners were not prisoners. The military policemen were not military policemen. They were German commandos, and the invasion of the Netherlands had just begun. These men belonged to the strangest unit in the entire German army, the Brandenburgers. They did not sneak in under cover of darkness. They walked straight up to the enemy in broad daylight, wearing his own uniform, and got away with it time after time. For 5 years, they were the best-kept secret of the Wehrmacht. What finally destroyed them was not the enemy, it was the regime they fought for. The idea came from one man, Theodor von Hippel, a captain in the Abwehr, German military intelligence. During the First World War, von Hippel had served in East Africa under General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, who kept a far larger British force occupied for years with only a handful of men. He had also studied the writings of the British officer T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, who drove the Turks to despair with Arab fighters. From those two examples, von Hippel drew a single lesson. Small groups of men who knew the enemy's language and customs could do more damage behind the lines than an entire battalion at the front. He took the plan to the regular army first. They turned it down. To many traditional Prussian officers, fighting in disguise was dishonorable, something no real soldier should stoop to. Von Hippel then went to Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr. Canaris had his doubts too, but he saw the possibilities, and under his department the unit was given room to take shape. Officially, it was a construction company. The full cover name was Baulehrkompanie zur besonderen Verwendung 800, a construction and training company for special purposes. Nothing about that name gave away what the men really did. The nickname they would go down in history under came from their first permanent barracks in the town of Brandenburg under Havel, just west of Berlin. That is how they became the Brandenburgers. Who they recruited was as unusual as what they did. The Brandenburgers looked for Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans who had grown up outside the borders of the Reich in Poland, the Baltic states, the Balkans or further afield. Men who spoke not only German but also fluent Polish, Russian, Serbian, French or Arabic, and who knew how to behave in those countries without standing out. They were all volunteers. They were organized into companies by language region, so that for almost every front there was a group ready to pass as the local population or as enemy soldiers. Their weapon was disguise. Sometimes they wore complete enemy uniforms, sometimes only a coat or helmet, sometimes ordinary civilian clothes with weapons hidden underneath. That carried a serious problem. Under the laws of war at the time laid down in the Hague Conventions, you were allowed to deceive the enemy, but fighting in his uniform counted as treacherous. Anyone caught in enemy uniform could be shot as a spy without the protection a prisoner of war was entitled to. The Brandenburgers tried to get around this by wearing a German uniform underneath their disguise, so they could identify themselves if things went wrong. How strictly they kept to that is unclear. The sources contradict each other, and in several operations the men wore no German uniform at all beneath their disguise. In North Africa, Rommel even explicitly forbade his Brandenburgers from wearing enemy uniforms, so the idea offered a paper protection that often did not exist in practice. Their forerunners showed the dark side of this kind of warfare straight away. During the invasion of Poland in 1939, a unit known as the Ebbinghaus Battalion operated there, made up of Polish-speaking ethnic Germans. Besides seizing bridges and junctions, according to several sources, these men were also involved in the murder of Polish civilians in Silesia. This was not yet the Brandenburgers, as they would later officially exist, but a number of these men did move on to the new unit. The line between commando operation and war crime was thin from the very beginning. Their big breakthrough came in May 1940 in the West. As the German armies invaded the Netherlands and Belgium, the Brandenburgers were tasked with seizing bridges intact before the defenders could blow them up. At Gennep they succeeded. A small group under Lieutenant Wilhelm Walter crossed the bridge disguised as Dutch military police escorting German prisoners and took out the guards. Almost at once a German armored train rolled across it, straight through the Dutch defensive line. One striking detail, some of the fake military policemen were real Dutchmen, members of the NSB, the Dutch National Socialist movement. Most of the other bridges the Brandenburgers tried to grab that day did go up in the air, a few times with the commandos still on them. For the German High Command, the successes weighed heavier than the failures. In the years that followed, Brandenburgers turned up everywhere. They went ahead disguised as Serbian laborers during the invasion of the Balkans. In June 1941, at the start of Operation Barbarossa, small groups crossed the border in Soviet uniforms to seize bridges and junctions before the Red Army could destroy them. Their most famous operation came in the summer of 1942. A group of 62 Baltic and Sudeten Germans under Baron Adrian von Völkersam was ordered to capture the oilfields at Maikop in the Caucasus, the black gold the entire German war economy was crying out for. Disguised as men of the NKVD, the feared Soviet secret police, and driving captured Russian trucks, they drove straight through the Soviet lines. On the way, they ran into a large group of Russian deserters. Instead of avoiding them, Völkersam talked them into returning to the front, and with those deserters as cover he moved almost freely through enemy territory. In Maikop, Völkersam passed himself off as an NKVD major from Stalingrad. The local commander believed him so completely that he personally gave him a tour of the city's defenses. When the German spearhead drew closer, the Brandenburgers struck. Using hand grenades, they faked an artillery attack, knocked out communications, and spread the false message that the city had to be evacuated. On 9 August 1942, German troops entered Maikop with barely a fight, and then the bitter outcome. The Soviets had already wrecked most of the oil installations themselves during their retreat. The Brandenburgers had pulled off a masterpiece of deception, but the strategic goal, usable oil for Germany, stayed out of reach. It sums up the whole unit. Tactically brilliant, but rarely enough to change the course of the war. Just at the height of their reputation, the unit began to change, and not for the better. The Brandenburgers grew from a company into a regiment and finally into a full division of many thousands of men. With that growth, their real strength disappeared. A handful of men can seize a bridge unseen. A whole division gets used as ordinary infantry. More and more often, the Brandenburgers stood at the front instead of behind it, among other things, in the fight against partisans in the Balkans. That partisan war was a dirty war. The German approach, known in the jargon as Bandenbekämpfung, was built on deterrence through violence, and it cost civilian lives on a massive scale. Entire villages were wiped out in reprisal for attacks, often without any evidence that the inhabitants had anything to do with them. How far the Brandenburgers themselves took part in specific atrocities is less sharply documented in the sources than the broader picture. What is certain is that the unit was used in a kind of warfare that was criminal through and through. Men who had once been trained for clever surgical operations ended up in the most merciless part of the occupation. The end came from within. Canaris' Abwehr had grown into a nest of resistance against Hitler. Around the failed assassination attempt on Hitler of July 20, 1944, Canaris was arrested and the Abwehr finally dismantled. With that, the protection the Brandenburgers had operated under all those years fell away too. Their arch-rival, the SS, had by then set up its own commando unit under Otto Skorzeny, and the leadership no longer felt any need for special operations. The Brandenburg Division was turned into an ordinary motorized unit and folded into the Großdeutschland Panzer Corps. What had once been Germany's most creative unit spent its final months fighting as plain infantry on the Eastern Front, where it was largely destroyed in the retreat. Around 1,800 men, including Völkersam himself, transferred to Skorzeny's SS Jagdverbände so they could keep fighting as commandos. Völkersam, the brain behind Maikop, was killed in January 1945 in Poland. So ended Theodor von Hippel's experiment. The Brandenburgers had proven that a small, clever unit could have an effect far out of proportion to its size, an idea that would form the basis for the modern special forces of many countries after the war. But in Nazi Germany itself, they were overtaken by the power struggle between the Wehrmacht and the SS, swallowed up by a war they could never have won, and in the end thrown away by the regime they had served. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss anything. See you next time.